Hey, welcome back, PVA kids. We're here for our next lesson in U.S. history. Today, we're going to be covering 9.3, and we're going to be covering World War II. There's a bunch in here on your unit test as well as the quiz, and there's a lot on your vocabulary over this World War II lesson. So make sure that you're paying attention, especially to the things that are those bold-faced words and terms that we see over the coming slides, because you'll see them all again. So what we want to do is we want to first start off by talking about not only what led up to America's entry into war, but also some of the major events of the war itself, both foreign and domestic, and then some of the impacts of the war afterwards. So let's go ahead and let's start off by talking about what had happened that in the years leading up to America's entry into the war and how we slowly got involved. Now, World War II had got started long before America became involved. In fact, we didn't become involved until December of 1941. But they had been fighting World War II really as early as 1939. In fact, you can make arguments that World War II began as early as 1935, 1936, especially in Asia and Africa. Now, in the years before the outbreak of World War II, for the Americans, all right, we were very afraid of the rise of dictators around the world would cause another war. We kind of saw that happening. And we saw dictatorships and totalitarian regimes rising throughout the world. In Russia, you had Joseph Stalin, you had Benito Mussolini, you had in Italy, you had Francisco Franco, in Spain, you had Adolf Hitler, in Germany, you had Hideki Tojo, in Japan. And so you've got all of these kind of these leaders all around the world. And so, but the United States wanted to stay out. You know, we wanted to stay neutral. We had always been trying to stay neutral in world affairs. I mean, Washington's Farewell Address, the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, let's stay out, especially of European affairs. And so between 1935 and 1937, the United States is going to pass a series of what are called Neutrality Acts. And it made it illegal for companies to sell and ship weapons to any good or nation at war. And the idea was that this would keep American ships out of foreign waters in wartime, and this would prevent them sinking, which would meant us we would kind of keep out of war. And so the Neutrality Acts were designed to keep us out of war. But they could only do so much because war was coming. And war would start with the invasion of Poland by both Germany and Russia in 1939. And all of this is happening during the same time that Roosevelt's running for a third term as president in 1940. I mean, he's going to campaign on the platform of neutrality with preparedness. And we do even start, having our first peacetime draft. But war comes, and war not only comes first to Poland, but then it comes to France. And France is invaded in 1940 and falls very, very quickly. I mean, Great Britain is barely able to get all of their troops out. They're able to get their troops out at Dunkirk. There's a great movie about that. You should check that out sometime. And the German Luftwaffe, which is their air force, starts to mercilessly pound England in what's called the Battle of Britain. And England and its allies need American aid more than ever. And so what we start to do is we start to, we go, look, we got to help our friends. And so we respond in 1941, in early 1941, with what's called the Lend-Lease Act. Now, the Lend-Lease Act is something that you need to know, and what this does is this allows the United States to start to send war supplies to our allied nations and to transport war-related goods on armed ships. And this is a big change from the Neutrality Acts from before. And what this does is this makes the United States into what is called the arsenal of democracy. And that's a phrase you're going to need to know. Oh, now this is huge for the United States. I mean, this is the big thing that helps to end the Great Depression, which is amazing. But this is going to be how we're going to help democracies around the world through this Lend-Lease Act. And we send literally billions of dollars to our friends. The United Kingdom gets over $5 billion of goods. Russia, the Soviet Union, we give them nearly $3 billion worth of goods as part of this arsenal of democracy. All right, we're going to be the war supplier. Now, we're not going to fight because we have no intention of fighting in 1941. But the fight's going to come to us. And that's because on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese are going to lead a surprise military attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is going to be the beginning of America's war in World War II. We didn't try and start it, but that war came to us as we were attacked A day that would live in infamy, bringing the America into the war itself. Now, we're in the war now. And so what we've got to do is we've got to not only win the war abroad, but we've got to win the war at home as well. And to win that war both in Europe and the Pacific, because we have to fight against the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians across the war, we're going to have to go through a process of mobilization. That means we've got to get ready to go to war. And so we're going to do a few things. First things first is we're going to create what's called the War Production Board. And what we start to do is we need to outproduce the Axis powers. We have to outproduce both the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians. We got to make more stuff. We have to make more planes and tanks and guns and bullets than they do. And this becomes really, really important to be able to win this particular war. In addition to this, we're also going to need soldiers to fight. And so we're going to create a new law that's called the Selective Service Act and the Selective Service System. And this is going to draft millions of men into military service. And what we see is we start to see how the economy is going to shift to wartime production during World War II. And this is oftentimes referred to as wartime conversion as we move over to producing all of these goods for war. Not only that, though, we didn't have time to not only just make other things, and we couldn't let anybody have whatever they wanted. We needed to save materials for those to be able to make those guns and tanks and ships and all that kind of stuff. And so what we're going to see is that wartime production is going to lead to shortages of consumer goods. And the U.S. government is going to impose what is referred to as rationing, which meant that during World War II, the government's going to mandate that only certain quantities of products, such as gas, meat, sugar, and coffee, could be used by normal people. And so people are going to get those ration cards. You see some of those ration stickers that are on the left-hand side over there. So you could only get so much gas, only so much coffee, etc., because a lot of that was being used by the soldiers. Now, World War II, though, is also going to have another major domestic impact, and that is for women. We're going to see nearly 6 million women are going to enter the workforce, not only just in the military, but also especially in wartime-related jobs. We're going to start to see that this kind of idea of Rosie the Riveter becomes kind of the big face of everything as women enter the industrial workforce, as men leave factory jobs to go fight overseas. And another major impact domestically is going to be a distrust of a certain segment of our population. A lot of people, especially on the West Coast, feared that a sizable Japanese-American segment of the population over there could potentially be disloyal. They could help the enemy or they could be spying. And although none were ever found out to actually have done that, as a result, in 1942, shortly after the war begins, President FDR is going to issue Executive Order 9066. And what this does is this creates what is called internment. What we do is we move 112,000 Japanese Americans into camps away from the Pacific coast. Now, this is a major infringement of liberty and incredibly controversial. And in fact, the United States admitted that it was wrong in doing so. It took them over 50 years. It wasn't until the 90s under President Clinton that we do this. But we did it during World War II because we were afraid that they were going to be disloyal and spies, although none of them ever were found to be so. Now, that's what was happening domestically in the United States. But what about actually the fighting overseas? Now, there's a few battles you need to know about. We're not going to get into all of them. But we decided that we were going to have a Europe first strategy. We're going to knock the Nazis out first before we focused our full attention on Japan. And part of that was we needed to have time to build up a bigger naval force. And that's just going to take a while. And we already had allies in Europe. And so we decided to open up the Western Front by invading Nazi-occupied France. That was our kind of first thing. And so to do so, this is all going to begin on June 6, 1944, with the largest invasion by sea in world history. And this becomes known as D-Day. It was technically called Operation Overlord. Now, you're going to need to know what D-Day was, and that was the liberation of Europe and the liberation of France by the United States. Right? And this is going to happen on what's called the Normandy coast. It's incredibly deadly, but we're able to be successful. Some great movies about this. You need to check them out. The Longest Day, starring John Wayne. You've got Saving Private Ryan with Tom Hanks. And one of my favorite miniseries that was ever on HBO is all about this. So go check those out. It's called Band of Brothers. But it was successful, all right? Now, we're able to not only advance through the Western Front, but after a series of battles, we liberate Paris, we win the Battle of the Bulge. And while all this is going on, the Soviets now have started to fight the Germans, and they fight what is called the Battle of Berlin. Now, you do need to know that the Battle of Berlin, it's one of the bloodiest battles in history. It takes place in the spring of 1945, and they defeat the Germans and take their capital city. This effectively ends World War II in Europe. And as the Battle of Berlin winds down, on April 30th, Hitler is going to commit suicide. And on May 9th, 1945, the German government, now Hitlerist, is going to sign an unconditional surrender to the Allies, effectively ending the war in Europe. And the world is going to celebrate VE Day. But we still have to defeat Japan. Now, the war was coming to an end in Europe. And so let's kind of wind the clock back just a little bit. And we have to continue to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. And so what we do is we start to send troops to the Pacific Theater. And it's a whole new kind of warfare, specifically focused around aircraft carriers. Now, the big turning point battle of this entire war against the Japanese is going to be the Battle of Midway. And the reason why it was a major turning point is that we were able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and they're the floating airfields in the Pacific. And by sinking them, we're able to start to gain a major advantage in this particular war. So after Midway, we start to regain islands controlled by Japan using a strategy called island hopping. And we're able to island hop all the way over or towards the Japanese home islands. Now, in 1945, though, FDR, is not able to finish out the war. He passes away. And that makes his Vice President, Harry Truman, the new President of the United States. And he has to decide how exactly he's going to end the war. Now, Japan had refused to surrender. And so Truman is going to order his new weapon, the nuclear bomb, to be dropped first on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And then, when Japan refused to surrender, he's going to drop a second one on Nagasaki just 3 days later. Now, we're going to learn a little bit more about the building and development of those bombs, because you'll need to know about that in your 9.4 video. Now, after that second bomb, Emperor Hirohito is going to surrender. And this ends World War II in the Pacific. Now, World War II does have some major consequences for the United States that you do need to know. Oh, and the 2 major consequences is, number 1, we become a major world power. But we're not the only one. The USSR also becomes a major world power. And there are now 2 superpowers, a capitalist and a communist country, that now kind of dominate global politics. And it is out of these 2 superpowers that we're going to be focusing on in the next unit as we talk about the Cold War. Well, that's all that we have time for today. Make sure that you know the actions leading up to war for the United States, including the Neutrality Acts and the Lend-Lease Act, why the United States became involved in the war, the major outcomes for the United States domestically, including women at work, wartime conversion, and especially rationing, and the internment of Japanese Americans. Know major battles, including the Battle of Berlin, as well as Midway, and know the outcomes of the war are about how the United States becomes a world power, and there are now 2 superpowers in the world. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Have a great day. Bye for now.